Welcome to Virtual Sentiments. I'm your host, Kristen Collins. On today's episode, we talk to Hannah Gais. Hannah is a journalist and researcher focused on the radical right at the Southern Poverty Law Center. We recorded this episode back in December 2024, soon after President Trump's electoral victory. So there's a lot that's happened since then that we unfortunately did not get to talk about. But you'll still see things that I think are relevant to today. So for example, we talk about the role of the far right in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And Hannah talks about how in the aftermath of that event, people lost the assumption that there would be always a peaceful transfer of power. And since we spoke, President Trump has indeed pardoned 1,500 participants in the attack on the Capitol building as one of his first moves in office. I think of this conversation as a bit of a taking stock in terms of what happened with respect to the far right during and after President Trump's first term. Hannah also walks us through the way that groups and individuals have used the internet, including the encrypted messaging app Telegram and the social media platform X, formerly known as Twitter. We talk about the debate about whether the U.S. government should enact domestic terrorism policies akin to foreign terrorism policies, and how the government already has plenty of tools at its disposal to deal better with these groups than they do. We end by interrogating how difficult it is to pin down Trumpism, and how so many people look at Trump and project on him the grievances and desires that they have. So keep all that in mind. This is a bit of a darker and I would say sadder, maybe frustrating or anger-inducing episode in terms of what we're talking about. But I think it's all important information that everyone should have in mind in our current political moment. You can really tell that we've recorded this episode in December 2024, not anytime more recently, because towards the end, I have a brief aside about how ridiculous it was to read about business leaders being excited about Trump's victory and his economic policies when we already knew he had intended to enact tariffs. And, well, we've already seen a little bit about how that's turning out, haven't we? Anyway, I'm really grateful that Hannah could so calmly and deftly teach us about a really difficult, challenging, upsetting, but important topic. Thanks for joining us today, Hannah.
Thanks for having me.
So there's a lot that we could talk about today. We are recording this in December of 2024. And so this is post-election. And I think given your expansive expertise and this political moment, I think what I really want us to be talking about is kind of a retrospective of how did we get here when it comes to the radical right. And so what is the state of the radical right now? Kind of looking back to, I mean, as far as you want to go back in terms of your expertise, but I think there's some sort of pivotal moments in American politics that we should have in mind when we think about these types of more extremist, terrorist individuals and groups. And that is the Unite the Right rally back in Charlottesville in 2017. And then I almost feels like Trump's presidency in some way was his first term was bookended by that. And then the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. And, you know, since 2021, excuse me, for the attack on the Capitol, you know, we've seen that in DC, like living in DC, we've had trials, criminal trials for those types of people who were there. And then now Trump has now won another term. And so we need to kind of take stock of where we are in America when it comes to these kind of white supremacist, white nationalist groups. So thanks for kind of walking us through a lot of like very challenging and complex politics. And I'll know, I think one of the things that you're, I think, especially adept at is knowing how much all of this activity is happening in real life and also online, and the way that digital technologies are used and kind of interact with these types of political actors. So I wondered if you might start us off with kind of the recent trends, and we'll kind of go back with this, but some of your work that you've published on this recently, including with your co-author, Cassie Miller at the Southern Poverty Law Center, has been to explore the way that there's been trends away from kind of traditional organizing among these groups toward what you guys call diffused systems of decentralized radicalization. So I wonder if you kind of just let's start things off with that and that sort of juxtaposition between what we normally think of as like traditional organizations versus this decentralized environment.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's kind of interesting about the past couple of years, particularly given where what I focus on in terms of white nationalism and neo-Nazism, is that these ideologies are certainly not on the decline per se, but the number of groups such as the ones that SPLC would track as real life groups has basically declined significantly since a pretty big high in 2017. And part of it is, I mean, there's a variety of factors. One of the biggest ones being scrutiny from law enforcement, particularly targeting kind of more terroristic neo-Nazi and white nationalist groups. The Base and Atomwaffen division are two examples of that. But there's also scrutiny from journalists, scrutiny from anti-racist and anti-fascist activists that all basically led to the decline of kind of these real world groups. But the thing is, like, you go online, it used to be Telegram, but now it's Twitter.
Yeah.
I refuse
X.
to call it X.
Yeah, I'm not going to make you call it X. I'll do it for us.
I'm an old guard poster. I will never call it X. It's too dorky. But
yeah, for sure. Worst branding move ever.
Exactly. You go on there and there's like these guys who are like making AI generated Hitler speeches and stuff and sharing them and getting thousands of likes on this content. I mean, there's a big distinction between online and offline organizing in the sense that like online organizing doesn't necessarily lead to offline organizing, but it can. I think Charlottesville actually being a very good example as to how some of this rhetoric, these memes, etc., can find their way into basically like an offline rally. Yeah, I mean, I think it's in terms of decentralization, there's not really any center for the white nationalist and neo-Nazi movement right now. It's all very fragmented, kind of different groups vying for attention. I think what certainly over the past year or two, I mean, you've had a bunch of different smaller neo-Nazi rallies, but I think like also in terms of sort of what we were seeing in 2017, it feels measurably different. A couple dozen neo-Nazis showing up, I think, is pretty fundamentally different than something like Unite the Right. But it's still, I mean, the amount of activity we're seeing, I think, is still worrying.
Yeah. So, I mean, to some degree, while there's been this decline in the traditional organizing, that doesn't necessarily mean the ideas themselves or people who are supporting those ideas are any less powerful, right? So, actually, before we kind of get into that, I was wondering if you could kind of just take us a step back. Again, it's like kind of recent history, but to the Unite the Right rally and just kind of give a refresher of what was happening at that time and some of the kind of key groups there.
Yeah. So Unite the Right were basically a couple of different rallies that actually happened in Charlottesville around that time. But Unite the Right was basically a large rally that brought together different wings of, I guess, what I would call the white power movement. I mean, people have use different terms for it. You could say the white supremacist movement, either one. Different wings of the white supremacist movement that I think historically had kind of been more fragmented, but found common cause to basically work together and had been emboldened by Trump's win. So the August rally basically came on the heels of some prior activity earlier that summer and slash late spring, and brought together basically what we would have then called the alt-right, along with kind of more traditional white nationalist like neo-Nazi groups such as the National Socialist Movement, which was once one of the largest neo-Nazi groups in the United States, was there. Members of the Klan, racist skinheads, and it basically brought them all under one umbrella to Charlottesville. I guess the rest is relatively well established. The rally didn't really take place and basically just descended into violence after it basically became. I mean, the situation became untenable. Police just declared a state of emergency, and everyone kind of fragmented. And I think it was kind of like for the alt-right at the time specifically, but also the broader movement as a whole, it kind of ended up being this inflection point that I think the impacts of it weren't really felt fully for like another year or two. So they come off of that basically. I mean, I think still essentially emboldened. You have Trump's comments, the very fine people on both sides. That was picked up by white supremacist activists and kind of ran with it. The main thing that basically was the big fallout from it is a lot of infighting. So disagreements about tactics. There's this civil case that was brought against over a dozen prominent organizers, the rally called Science v. Kessler, that again took years to finally actually go to court, but basically stymied organizing and kind of created this sort of churn of infighting that ultimately brought that kind of era of the movement to, I don't want to say a close because these things never really disappear, but basically it changed it fundamentally in a way that I don't think any of these groups have ever truly recovered. Where I would probably peg the death of the alt-right, quote unquote, would be around 2018, and that I think is very much tied to Charlottesville, very much tied to the fact that after this event, which did not go as they had planned, there was a lot of finger pointing, and there was a lot of people trying to lay blame on different people, and that then spiraling out into essentially causing this collapse of the movement.
Yeah. And so just taking a step back too to the alt right, because I think we can kind of also take stock of like the way that we used to talk about how we would think about these groups then, and then kind of taking those lessons into now looking at this future term that's going to be happening. Why was the term alt right used, and what was useful about it at the time? And how much was that embedded in kind of the very online nature of these individuals?
So the term alt-right is basically a shortened version of the term alternative right, which was a term that Richard Spencer came up with in 2008. It was the title of a speech by paleoconservative thinker Paul Gottfried, and it's basically used in the title in a version of the speech that went up on Talkies magazine. It was essentially a way like, I think it's interesting to tie it into paleoconservatism because it was certainly sort of this way of reframing the right and kind of creating a new viable. This is sort of like the kind of like when they say the title of a movie thing, but to make a so-called alternative right, the alternative right, alt-right, whatever the hell you want to call it, in 2008 was very different than what it was in 2016. I think this is a movement that's undergone multiple iterations, partly, and I think like sort of the way these political movements sort of end up, this big tent organizing, like that's kind of inevitable. Back in 2008, it was very much more a niche intellectual project. By the time you hit 2015, 2016, it's very much building up, trying to build up into, I mean, Spencer and others are basically trying to build it up into much more of a viable political project. And with that comes a lot of this real world activity.
And so was it to some degree, and I think if I remember correctly, some of the debates about like people who were not a part of the movement but trying to make sense of it, like journalists, scholars, there's sort of like, should we even use the term? Like, is it useful? Because to some degree, like, to what degree were those individuals just trying to make really obviously patently noxious ideologies, white nationalism, white supremacism, those types of ideas seem more palatable, seem more kind of mainstream? And then I guess to what degree did that become unnecessary throughout the course of the Trump presidency? So even if there was sort of this fragmentation and infighting that you were describing after the Unite the Right rally, were there ways in which the Trump presidency kind of then also made it easier to kind of diffuse the ideas at the same time, if that makes sense? Like it was also because to some degree these were becoming less stigmatized and less taboo.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I guess going back to the usefulness of the term, I mean, I think it is useful because I think kind of at the end of the day, some of reporting on this stuff involves basically one, describing what they're doing and saying. So then you get at you can get at like some of the criticisms of using the term through that. But then number two, I mean, it was a term that they themselves were using, and I think it was describing, I mean, certainly historically there's been precedent for that kind of big tent approach to organizing. But I think it's still useful as a historical term to basically show maybe the differences in the movement between what it looks like then and what it looks like now. I think a lot of I mean, and I guess I should probably clarify that I started researching and reporting on this stuff in early 2016, particularly by going to alt-right events. So I mean, I guess I'm somewhat coming at it from the lens of someone who was very much got pulled into researching this stuff because of it. I think a lot of the criticism of the use of the term basically kind of stemmed from the fact that a lot of reporters and I think even researchers didn't really necessarily know how to handle the burst of white supremacist activity around the Trump election, or even for that matter, handle Trump. I mean, and frankly, a lot of people still don't.
Yeah. 100%. It's interesting because these things were still extreme. Like these ideas, these individuals are very, even though they were getting sort of endorsed to some degree implicitly, perhaps by Trump, or at least very clearly not being denounced the way you would expect a president to denounce. Then there was this fragmentation, but then there's this way in which, like, does the diffusion of did Trump's presidency, his term, his refusal to kind of more clearly denounce and condemn these individuals end up leading, like, and also his own policies, immigration policies, his own xenophobic, racist policies, were to some degree making that type of formal organizing and that type of like terms like alt-right kind of unnecessary, because it was kind of a mainstreaming. Like the diffusion doesn't necessarily mean a weakening. It just means a change in form. Is that a good way to put it?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And I think one of the things that has kind of frustrated me a little bit about a lot of the mainstreaming talk is that I think it's pretty simplistic, because implicit in kind of the concept of mainstreaming these movements would seem to be that basically the movement itself goes mainstream, which is not really the case. It's more that the ideas and the rhetoric that was used by this movement has been kind of scooped up by the mainstream right and then manipulated to suit their own ends. I think there's a lot of reasons why this happened. I think there's not actually a simplistic answer to why it happened. Maybe get to that in a second. But I think one of the basically big things that it indicates is that that was kind of what was appealing to this younger generation of right-wing activists. That you have this generation of right-wingers who are growing up on 4chan, who are growing up on 8chan, I don't know, the Donald Trump subreddit. So, like that's a bit of a throwback. But
Yeah.
Twitter, now Twitter. But you basically have these guys who are like having their views shaped by right wing online activity and being shaped by this kind of terminally online mindset that ends up being very reactionary, but still is like kind of different than what you would have considered mainstream conservatism maybe like 15 years ago.
No, that's great. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And so I kind of like just going to those bookends. Then we get to the end of Trump's presidency and the Stop the Steal, and maybe getting a little bit more into kind of having to kind of separate out. There's these groups that have these extremist groups that have their own have these ideologies and have their own goals, and then, like you said, kind of more mainstream politicians on the right, Trump, for example, but also maybe media figures like Tucker Carlson now, other figures, kind of using these for their own ends. And so I guess I wanted to kind of actually then, how do we kind of navigate the roles of those different political actors and those different goals, and then what happened on January 6th? Just because, like, the other thing, just to, like, I don't know, I've talked about January 6th a little bit on the podcast, I think in the first season, which was closer to, when it actually happened. But I honestly do feel like we as a community, like a state, and also like scholars, like, even though people think about it, but we don't like talk about it as much as I think we should. I mean, this was just for American democracy, like an incredibly dark and pivotal moment. Like, I think the rest of our lives will be defined to some degree what happened on that day and the way the government has failed to kind of reckon with that attack on democracy. So just sort of, but so let's dig in a little bit in terms of, like, from your perspective on, like, the expertise you have of trying to make sense of. I mean, I think it's quite clear that there's sort of Trump's own goals and his own actions on that day versus also then the mobilization of different groups on that day as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think, like, it's funny because you hear Democrats bring up, particularly during the last election cycle, kept bringing up January 6th as like an example of Trump's fascism. But I think that the way that, like, January 6th is talked about is, particularly in kind of left liberal spaces, has always struck me as a little weird, because I think fundamentally the biggest takeaway from January 6th, and I think the thing that is most concerning about the fact that basically the GOP has just normalized it. Like, when I was setting aside Trump offering, or not necessarily offering, saying he's going to pardon a bunch of Jan 6ers, kind of question mark as to whether that's actually going to happen. I mean, when I was at CPAC this year, there was a pinball machine that was basically like Jan 6 themed. I mean, it's just normal now, and I think, like, the thing that's, like, particularly concerning about that, I think the U.S. as a whole has probably had less political violence than many other countries. If you look at the history of Europe, I mean, but it's that basically we had decades upon decades of just this assumption that there would be a peaceful transfer of power, and then suddenly there wasn't. And that's basically, like, I think if you had to summarize what January 6th means for the right and kind of what it means going forward, it's the fact that just isn't, the assumption that there will be a peaceful transfer of power now just isn't a thing anymore. I mean, I think it was pretty telling during the last presidential election that even after Donald Trump had won, that you would go online and you would see some of these guys talking about some of the Senate races where Democrats were leading, and there were people just being like, "That election is being stolen." And it's like, "What? You won."
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah. No, it's sort of it's no long it's gone beyond necessarily even a strategic rhetoric, like a rhetoric chosen in a certain condition, but a just completely more nihilistic kind of rejection of any kind of legitimacy, even when it's not necessary to gain power, which is. I mean, both are bad, but it is something that we have to be thinking about in terms of when we think about the future. And so I guess I wanted to also to that point, kind of getting to the idea of, okay, so in the wake of January 6th, then there was much more calls for we have Biden's presidency, right? And so now I would be interested in your thoughts in terms of what were the trends among these groups, kind of different between Trump's first term and Biden's first term. But I think the other thing that you've written a lot about and we've talked about, and I think is very interesting, probably would be very interesting for many different listeners of different political perspectives, is the idea of kind of after January 6th, then this kind of move or the calls from people for treating domestic terrorism with the same kind of laws, legislation that we have for the war on terror and for foreign terrorism. But I think it's one of these things where when you think about like creating more punitive power in the hands of the state, if you feel if you trust the people in power, maybe that's not so scary. And then you get people who are anti-democratic, have much more extreme exclusionary policies. And it's like, well, now it seems kind of obvious why we might not want to do that. I don't know that I want people in Trump's administration being able to wield war on terror like laws within the country, or at least any more than we already have those types of extreme policies in our criminal justice system. But why don't you kind of walk us through that kind of debate that happened during Biden's presidency and maybe still today? I mean, we're still in Biden's presidency, but still ongoing, of this idea of like, what should we do about domestic terrorism? Or what should we do about these extreme groups? I mean, should we be treating them more like foreign terrorists?
Yeah, so I mean, I think some of the discussion around domestic terrorism also ties back to Charlottesville. There was basically, I mean, because I think a lot of people were sort of rightfully like, well, why did very little happen in terms of criminal charges related to that event? Honestly, compared to Jan 6, to some extent, yeah. I mean, there was this group, Rise Above Movement, which was led by this guy named Rob Rundo, that clearly targeted federal investigation that spun out into multiple criminal charges against members of that group. Rundo himself has faced charges related to activity around basically like street fighting at other radical right events during that time period. But they were really the main group that faced any kind of federal criminal charges there. With January 6th, I mean, I think particularly after it, there was a lot of talk around the need for stronger domestic terrorism laws, but then like people not necessarily fully defining what that meant. The call for FTO designations against domestic white supremacist groups. So that actually predates Jan 6th. So in 2020, there's this group called Atomwaffen Division, which was a neo-Nazi group who basically kind of combined sort of militia-like activity with plotting for acts of white supremacist terror. So they ascribe to this ideology called white power accelerationism. Well, less ideology, more of a tactic, but regardless. They embrace this tactic known as white power accelerationism that basically sees acts of violence and as a means of bringing about societal collapse that they then believe will usher in the formation of a white ethno state. So it's essentially like, it's a very apocalyptic mindset. So this group had kind of seen some of the fallout and failures of Charlottesville as sort of indicative of the failure of kind of traditional political organizing, like the tactics that most of the members of the alt-right used, and saw accelerationism as the main way forward. Now, the Feds certainly took notice of these guys. And in early 2020, there's basically some discussion about possibly naming them a foreign terrorist organization. So that's a designation that the State Department uses that basically allows them to seize assets, freeze assets, etc. What's interesting about it, though, is Atomwaffen Division is not foreign. It was founded in Florida. But the argument felt a little bit convoluted because there were Atomwaffen Division chapters, quote unquote, abroad. It was kind of like this, to some extent, like it was sort of this like became this sort of meme that people could pick up and then just kind of like run with their imagery and run with the name. I remember coming across around the same time like a group calling itself Atomwaffen Division in Russia, and like that seemed to be some of the logic around it. So they ultimately decide not to do this, which is, I want to be clear, good. But in the past couple of years, they've been using a slightly lesser designation called specially designated global terrorist against some overseas white supremacist groups. The first one, which a lot of people have called neo-Nazi, but they've collaborated with neo-Nazis, but they not really ideologically that. Russia has many years of its own particular breed of anti-Semitism. There's this group called the Russian Imperial Movement that instead of Atomwaffen Division, they basically make some big announcement. The State Department makes some big announcement that they're naming that a specially designated global terrorist group. Then this year, they name this group called Nordic Resistance Movement SDGT. It's acronym that's very easy to write out, but very annoying to say. That's kind of been, I think, sort of the consequence of that tug and pull. But it's still like concerning because I think sort of at the end of the day, and there's an expert I've talked to a lot for these kinds of pieces, Mike German, who is at the Brennan Center and is a former FBI agent who has made this argument very, very coherently and much more coherently than I'm about to make it. But basically, like at the end of the day, with these groups, the ones that are engaged in criminal activity, you can just get them on criminal activity. Like you don't have to create this elaborate, like these designation, like designating them an FTO. You can still investigate groups like Atomwaffen Division, and the feds did, and they did prosecute members of Atomwaffen Division on various charges. They have the tools, like they basically have the power to look into these groups, to take apart these groups, to indict them on criminal charges when necessary. But it kind of feels like they're just dropping the balls in multiple ways because they don't really fully understand. It feels like they don't always understand how the movement works, but then they're also like running with something like the FTOs, I think would have just been a civil liberties disaster. I think to me it's kind of like a question when you're talking about dealing with these violent white supremacist groups. Just dealing with any white supremacist groups in general is like, it's ultimately a question of what kind of society we want to live in. Do we want to live in a society where we're reenacting some of the worst and most grotesque civil liberties violations of Bush era war on terror? I don't think so.
No, exactly. And thinking about what those same civil liberty violations can be executed against all sorts of other groups that people might have more sympathies for as being more democratic and less exclusionary, less hateful, not actual hate groups. Yeah, no, okay. I think that's really helpful actually to walk us through all that. And so one thing I wanted to kind of bring us back to, and is the online element to things. So you were talking earlier about, so actually some of the groups that have been prosecuted or recently in some cases are relating to the encrypted app Telegram. But you were also saying earlier that, and that which people also refer to as Terragram. And so you were also talking about, X, and this has always been the case for, recent, we've been talking about the way that people use digital media. And so I guess I was interested a little bit more of the way that online spaces kind of incentivize certain actions or tendencies among the groups, and sort of, the way that people have been deplatformed on social media platforms like Facebook, but then are still then going to other apps, and you can kind of give us a little bit of a window into those dynamics as you've seen them.
Yeah. So just to probably start to explain a little bit about what Terragram is more specifically.
Yeah, and I don't know. I'm relying on your work on that. I can't believe I didn't know about it, but I mean I knew about the app, but I didn't know how much all this stuff was going on.
Yeah. So Terragram basically refers to this pretty loose network of neo-Nazi groups that espouse this idea of white power accelerationism, but really saw in-person organizing as like a problem. They basically, it was instead like a network in which people could share kind of materials for like 3D printed weapons, bomb making materials, various white supremacist propaganda, particularly after mass shootings. They might circulate manifestos, but it's always been this pretty loose network, and I mean, it was much more active when I first started at SPLC in 2019. It was one of the first things I really dove into. So around that time, Anamorphin Division was still a thing. The Base, another white supremacist group that espouses similar tactics. Base is still kind of around, but it was like it was much more of a thing then. And Terragram was then kind of like connected to those and sort of served as, I think, this kind of milieu for this particular accelerationist sect. It was basically, I mean, you could just go on the platform and join the group. Like, I think I remember like one day back in like October 2019 or something, I basically just fired up a Telegram sock and just started joining these channels. I was like, oh, well, that's easy. The next thing you know, your computer has like 50 copies of James Mason's Siege on it. So that's where things were at then. But I mean, these channels would get like banned by the platform for content violations. I think Telegram is also kind of an interesting dynamic too, where channel might be banned in Apple or Google. So if you download the Telegram app on your phone and you try to join one of these channels, you can't. It's banned by the app. But so you have to download Telegram's desktop.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, this is getting too technical.
No, actually, I was curious about that because I was sort of interested in, I think content moderation is a whole separate issue that's obviously beyond just the terrorist groups. But it's just interesting to think about, like, to remind people that it can happen at different levels. It can happen, like the company itself can act in some way, or the app stores can do it. And I think to some degree, I think, I don't know which is better or whatever, but that's just something that is itself like kind of a debate. I guess what I'm trying to say is a lot of people, I think the U.S. First Amendment protections prevent the government from doing policies for content moderation, right? But companies can do it. But then also, once you have once it's in the hands of private companies, it's actually, there's a lot of different ways it might be done. It's not going to just be the company the platform itself, but it can be the company that sells the platform, like Apple and Google.
Exactly. Basically, what's kind of interesting about them after, I mean, I think like 2019, 2020 was kind of the peak of this network, loosely described network. I always kind of want to hedge that this thing is not that organized.
It's very decentralized,
It's
diffused.
decentralized.
Yeah.
Yeah. right after Jan 6, though, basically, I think Telegram took a much more strict position in terms of some content moderation and really went to town on banning a lot of these channels. So they kind of adjusted some of their tactics a bit, basically starting these smaller private chats where you sort of had to basically join, and I think it would then possibly be vetted. But they were still sharing the same stuff, and there were two major things that kind of have really torn it apart. So the first was the federal government arrested Brandon Russell, who's the founder of Atomwaffen and Division, in early 2023, basically on charges that he and his co-conspirator were plotting to blow up electric infrastructure around Baltimore, essentially according to charging documents, basically to help incite a race war. So kind of goes back to what they do.
That's like an example of the white power accelerationist tactic and approach and kind of framing, kind of create chaos and sort of apocalyptic moment.
Exactly. So he was active in a lot of these Telegram chats. We published a piece basically outlining the pseudonyms that he was using there and kind of his activity in some of these smaller chats. And then this summer, the feds picked up two more people who were kind of at the heart of Telegram, really. Someone named Dallas Humber and Matthew Robert Allison. Both of them were very, very active within the Telegram network for years. Allison and Humber, I mean, the officials describe them kind of as the ringleaders of the current network. So operating a bunch of these different channels. Allison used the name Ban This Channel. Humber was basically doing these, she released these audio recordings of her really, I don't know. I listened to a couple of them and they're honestly extremely unnerving listening to these things being read. These manifestos.
For you to describe something as unnerving, considering everything you have to consume for your job studying hate, it means it's got to be pretty bad.
Yeah. So she's basically, because she does these audio recordings of terrorist manifestos, normal hobby, under the pseudonym Miss Gorehound. She's basically the narrator of Telegram, and these two are kind of picking them getting arrested and facing pretty significant charges for their involvement in the network is pretty significant. The network didn't really recover from Russell's arrest, but this is basically just kind of it's not donezo in the sense that there are still some channels associated kind of with that milieu, but what it was when I first started here at SPLC, no. it's not the same. I mean, there's a bunch of different factors that go into that. I mean, UK prescribed Telegram earlier this year, and these arrests certainly, I think, it's hard to see those two things as not connected to some degree.
Well, and actually, since you brought that up, the sort of UK policy with Telegram, that kind of gets me back to that civil liberties question to some degree. I mean, obviously, I want these groups to be prosecuted and these individuals to be prosecuted, but I also, there's sort of the extent to which people might also regulators, officials might also be extremely skeptical, trying to create policies that weaken or prohibit encryption in apps, and that seems to me also kind of a civil liberties issue too. So, do you have any kind of thoughts on those types of debates and specifically kind of encryption in apps? Because it's interesting how obviously I think journalists often, for example, have to rely on encrypted apps, right? I mean, so there's a lot of ways in which these technologies are useful for all sorts of political purposes and not necessarily something we should be trying to eradicate.
Yeah, I think a lot of it kind of, I mean, well, first of all, it terrifies me. It terrifies me, particularly going into a second Trump administration where they're all talking about retribution, which I don't know. I take those comments as who knows
Yeah,
what
we
they'll
don't
do.
know yet what that means. Yeah.
It's also just, I think it's frustrating to me because it feels like there's just this assumption that we somehow shouldn't have privacy and we should. Like, I don't know. My husband and I use Signal to talk to each other. Like, does is there some reason why? And I think it's like set on disappearing messages too. So, like, is there some reason why like you can't have that privacy, that expectation of privacy with your electronic devices? And like a lot of the talks about the dangers of encryption, yeah, okay, like fine. Maybe the feds can't join XYZ group or easily or something or see into like how a group is operating. Sure. But I think like again, it kind of goes back to this question of like, what society do we want? Do we want one where the federal government or even private companies can just jump in and read your messages? I mean, Twitter can see your DMs. That doesn't make me feel particularly great.
Yeah. One of many reasons I don't really use that thing anymore.
Yeah, I can't say I use DMs much anymore.
Yeah.
But and like in retrospect, though, like why did we assume that that would be okay? Why did we assume that some private company would have our best interests at heart in terms of our privacy? There's nothing that's happened within technology in the US that indicates that they do.
Yeah, it all matters whether our interests align. Yeah, I do think that it's sort of like what you were saying about the legislation around prosecuting different groups, where it's like if there is criminal activity happening, we already have the tools, the power to prosecute on those activities, and those activities will be evident. I think what's really going on with encrypted messaging, I mean, there's some degree to which that might be helpful, but usually there's evidence elsewhere as well, right? So it's not what is actually happening that you could only see through access to those messages isn't necessarily something that would even rise to. Of course, there are exceptions with things like child sexual abuse material, things like that, which we do have policies for too. So I think that's also important. But it just seems to me like we kind of have to keep that broader image in mind that you just said too, about like what kind of society do we want to live in and what is actually feasible, and to what degree are we actually undermining our own the sort of principles and the way of life that we supposedly are trying to defend and maintain through those laws in the first place, things like privacy. But you're right that I think we can't set aside the sort of state surveillance question and the private surveillance question, which also requires then I think some way to figure out protections for users and consumers against the very kind of platforms that they're using. So actually, that reminded me, or bringing up Twitter. How has kind of Elon Musk's kind of changes to Twitter as a platform, has that led to new ways of people on this extreme radical right of using Twitter? I'll admit I don't really spend a lot of time on there anymore. So you would know better than I do. I know that.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I've been trying to use it less just because it feels, part of it is it just feels so empty to some extent. Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a little weird, like watching the platform change under him running it. Yeah, it's been kind of funny because it sort of feels like it's like the gang's all back, and like there's this publication run by former Atomwaffen division members that for years had basically just been on Telegram and would periodically get deplatformed there and then rejoin. And I noticed about a month and a half ago that they're on Twitter, and somewhat recently was like having some back and forth with them. And I was like, this is just like today and things that wouldn't have happened 5 years ago. Um, or they like that would happen, they would immediately get banned. But I think one of the things that's just so unnerving about it, and like honestly the internet kind of as a whole, is like the proliferation of just AI junk combined with then the lack of moderation and kind of the fact that it's basically just become like Gab 2.0 is like all of that together, I think just makes it into this like interesting encapsulation of everything that's wrong with the internet right now. Ed Zitron had a really good piece about this in his newsletter a couple of weeks ago. But basically, like, so much of the internet now is just not designed for users and is just making it kind of a disaster and unusable and unfun. Like, you go to a website, I don't know, like most media outlets or something is just overrun by ads. You go to Twitter and it's like half of your For You feed is like, mine is like, some of these are good. Raccoon photos. Some white nationalist that I outed 4 years ago keeps popping up there, who I don't follow.
Just what you want to see.
Well, it's fine. He actually soft blocked me when I tried to follow him, I think about a year ago. The thing is, like, it's just crap. It kind of feels like you're, and I don't think the internet has always been kind of a shit show. It's just there's so much. It kind of feels like you're just like wandering into just like in New York, because they just put like the trash on the streets, like the bags of trash on the streets. It feels like you're kind of just like whenever you're using the web these days, it's like a 90-degree day. You're in Midtown and you're walking around, and it's trash pickup day, but the trucks haven't arrived, and it's just that every day. You're not getting anything from it. There's no interesting discussions that are happening anymore because like you're just either seeing AI slop or groypers.
No, that makes sense. I mean, it's interesting with Twitter. Twitter was already kind of struggling in the ad business before Elon bought it, and like digital advertising. And it's funny that I feel like, and we probably have talked about this before, I'm sure, with people, but basically when you make it such a trashy, disgusting place to be, like companies don't want to sell ads on your site anymore. They don't want, I mean, there's a real limit to how much, I think morality necessarily like comes into play in terms of what companies, who they decide to work with and where they're willing to place their ads and things like that. But there are limits. There are things they don't want their ads next to Nazis. And so it was actually also like it's bad for business. But if Elon doesn't want to use it as a business, and to some degree it's paid off for him politically and in terms of his kind of power, then it's doing its job. It doesn't necessarily need to be a money-making scheme, right? So, but that being said, yeah, I mean, I do think that it's a real. I think if anybody had any doubts, like maybe 6 months ago, 8 months ago about it, I mean, I think it is dead in terms of kind of mainstream political public discourse online. And I do think, I think thinking about if something will replace it, Blue Sky, Threads. I wonder how many people can say Threads with and keep a straight face. But anyway, yeah, I maybe there's like do you think there'll be? I've started following people's Substacks. I mean, Substack has its own issues, but I almost feel like newsletters, almost like blogging's come back, but that's like not the same as like a kind of public connector. I mean, I think this sort of we have had this loss of like I guess what people call the monoculture or whatever, but it's not just like monoculture. It's not just like not everybody's tuning into Game of Thrones every night or something or whatever, Seinfeld back in the day and things like that. But it's like we don't have like a common. I was thinking actually, sorry, I'm just a little bit of ramble, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this, Hannah, though. But maybe, but my parents, I love them and they listen to my podcast. So and I've said this to them. They love to watch like the local news. even though like they don't actually, it doesn't really, never has anything that actually relates to their lives, rarely, where they are. And it's just like a grounding practice for them. Like when they visit our house and they stay with us, we don't actually have TV, but we have Hulu, and usually you can put the news on, like the live news on. And it helps them like feel grounded. Like it gives them like a connection to the world in some way. And I realized that like that's kind of what Twitter was for me, as fucked up as that is. But now Blue Sky isn't quite doing it, and it's like it's almost, I feel like we as millennials, like that was our local news, and like it has a lot of trash. It's not actually that useful, like, but it's just like it gave you this like this center, and it made you feel connected to it, and it gave you something to talk about at work, like that type of thing, right? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I'm grateful for Blue Sky, particularly because one of the things that they are promising to do, and I'm hesitant to take any social media company at its word about anything. But one of the big problems with Twitter for a long time, and Facebook and other companies, is like downplaying links, that it became like much harder to share your work, and like that did have a very strong impact on digital media. I don't want to say that like that was the reason why there were lots of layoffs, because there's like 1,800 reasons why there are lots of layoffs in digital media and why the industry is a complete shit show right now. But journalism broadly is a complete shit show right now. But the fact that they are saying, again, grain of salt as to whether this will continue, they are saying that they will basically bury links, I think it's good. But it definitely kind of feels like we've lost something. And like, I don't know if it's necessarily Twitter or like something. It just feels everything is so disjointed. Like, and it's like stuff that will be wildly popular in some circles, and it's just like you never hear of. Like talking a while ago, a couple of weeks ago, with someone about actually kind of about this, and brought up this podcast called Call Me Daddy, which I like literally never heard.
I know what you're talking about. I've never listened to it, but I know about it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, and it's like, I don't know, apparently extremely popular. I had no fucking
it's like
idea
one of the
what
biggest. It might actually be the most popular. I don't know. I'm not sure, but it's very, very popular.
Yeah, I mean, it's like Joe Rogan, but for women or something like that.
I had not heard it described that way, but that is probably right.
Yeah, but like, it's like basically there's so many options now that like there's almost still kind of, it feels a little bit like there is some sort of form of monoculture, because we're all stuck with like streaming apps like Spotify, or I don't know, I use Spotify but I kind of hate it, like Hulu, Apple TV, and you're limited to like the options that are on those. And like I remember back in the day, I was a really big, please federal government do not use this as an opportunity to investigate me. I was really big into torrenting music, and was on this site that basically like was for audiophiles, that basically kind of prioritized trying to get like more niche music. And one of the things you had to do when you used it was kind of keep your ratio of like contributing content to the site, but then so you could download more. Otherwise, you would get your account locked or something. And you would actually like discover interesting things. But like algorithms now, they're supposed to do that allegedly, but they don't really. You're sort of just locked into the content that you can find on one of these apps, and it feels like we're losing a lot.
Do you feel that some of these dynamics that we're talking, these like trends we feel like we're perceiving, do you think that is going to fundamentally change the way, or like affect the way that you do your work and you research these groups going into this next presidency, next term?
Probably. I mean, I think it's very funny to be 2024, Twitter be an empty cesspool, and it still be very important to my work. But like, I think it's going to be interesting kind of seeing what takes off. I think one of the interesting parts of the past election cycle was maybe like the importance of something like Joe Rogan. And the fact that on the left, like, there isn't really that. I guess I personally find the concept of influencers kind of annoying, but it's clearly something that, like, the Democrats need to really think about, and maybe aren't thinking about as effectively as right wingers, because yeah, I mean, there's, like, even if I, like, look at some of the content that's recommended to me on Spotify, I'm not really the person who uses it for podcasts, and when I do, it's like really normie stuff like Radio Lab. It's like the recommendations I'm getting are all kind of like right or center right, like Joe Rogan, Lex Friedman, and yeah, I think that's gonna keep having impacts for years to come.
It's interesting because the Democrats were kind of ahead of the curve when it came to Obama's presidency using social media and Facebook. And it does feel like they've fallen behind in terms of this being kind of the age, political age of social media, of influencers, and to the degree that the right always had, some people on the sort of news entertainment, like Alex Jones and Rush Limbaugh, that's there are these presidents that now it's almost like what we were just talking before. It's almost like it's like a sort of, Joe Rogan isn't, I'm not trying to say he is just like Alex Jones, but there's some kind of familial connection between them in terms of how they capture audiences and can kind of supercharge a political candidates or movements and ideas. And it's interesting because I think some people would say, oh, the left does have XYZ things. But I think sometimes what's actually very kind of liberal, like centrist and moderate, gets kind of like treated as the left, and people kind of forget what like actual left politics looks like because of the way that the American two-party system kind of, I think, has made it a little bit harder for people to see those different political approaches that we kind of subsume as just like the left and right.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what it kind of boils down to is, I mean, two factors. I mean, number one, like, basically letting the right kind of dictate what that kind of future of, I don't want to call it journalism, but like right wingers are calling it journalism, but kind of the future of that kind of like talk radio space, so to speak, is. And talk radio is obviously very important to the mainstream right for decades. Back when people listened to radios, maybe that's what we should all do. We should just listen to radio more often. But I mean, the other thing too, with kind of like more left leaning movements, is it sort of feels like there's like this. There's no opportunity to dream. There's no opportunity to think big. Like, it's, and I think the people that kind of want to do that are often kind of squished, and that has to change, because like the way you get societal change isn't by basically saying you're the party of what, you're the party of like the current system. You don't,
like a defensive crouch, like working from a defensive crouch rather than an actual vision.
Yeah, you can't do anything from a defensive crouch. You need to basically take a jump. And it sort of feels like, and this kind of felt like this in the first Trump administration, and it feels like this going into the second, despite those 4 years in between, that like still no one's really doing that. And so reasons for it, I mean, you kind of look back at like what it means to be, say, an artist now, or like a writer now, as opposed to years ago. It's making a living off of this stuff is totally different. Pay rates at magazines are terrible, if you can even write for a magazine. So I think there's a lot that needs to kind of change on that front to sort of open up that kind of possibility for thinking, for dreaming, for kind of coming up with a better world that feels really hippy dippy, but whatever.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's, I do think it's important to try to keep to optimism in terms of I don't think you can just fight. Again, I don't think you can just fight defensively. I don't think you can just fight negatively. I think you have to like have something that you're fighting for rather than simply against. So I think it's worth. I mean, it's hard to do that, I think, but I think it's something we got to do anyway. And I think we can't let our kind of cringe at sounding naive or new agey or whatever like prevent us from actually trying to get there, trying to not let our cynicism just turn into our critique turn into cynicism, turn into nihilism, right? I did want to get one last thought again, just kind of trying to prepare myself for the next 4 years and who knows how long after that, of what that's going to be like. But I was interested. You did have this recent piece on Tucker Carlson's kind of traveling roadshow, and I was just sort of thinking about like again, kind of what do we think about? We talked a lot about these like kind of unknown figures who though are are unknown in the sense like they're not famous in the way that Tucker Carlson is, and they are the fringes of the right. But then you have someone like him, and what do you think people should be looking out for in terms of how to make sense of these powerful figures, not just people on the fringes, but people who have a bullhorn, who are, have an imprimatur of, legitimacy to them, but have still very extreme, are kind of peddling racist conspiracy theories, things like that. What is sort of like your advice for people trying to make sense of those dynamics and what that will mean for Trump and making sense of Trump's Trump's second term?
I think a lot of it kind of boils down to sort of they're the people who are kind of defining what Trumpism will be. Trumpism is kind of a loose concept. I think like whether it's the alt-right or like someone like Michael Anton, like trying to define what Trumpism has been is kind of a complicated process. It's sort of like kind of Trump is he's his own thing, and then there are these network of activists, politicians around him that are basically trying to ride his coattails. I think probably the closest that we come to some kind of definition of like what Trumpism means for the future is Project 2025. But even then, like I think kind of it's I feel like sometimes it's a little confusing because you have to like you have to kind of see these things as both having some of their own life cycles. It's a contested space, I guess, is what I would say. And I think kind of going forward, kind of like people like Tucker Carlson are kind of going to be what you look to see kind of what Trumpism is going to be about. Like these are kind of the people who have been designated to be the ones who are sort of in charge of like helping define this movement going forward. And I think what's kind of interesting about Tucker is kind of like, I mean, going back to the mainstreaming thing. So, I mean, the Daily Caller was very much kind of an incubator, I think unintentionally or otherwise, but for a lot of kind of some of these background figures that were active in the alt-right, people like Scott, I mean, basically like names that aren't necessarily worth getting into because most people are probably going to be like, who the hell are you talking about? But there were like there was a period of time where there's this kind of idea called entryism, where it would be these right-wing figures who would be kind of simultaneously kind of aligned with like white nationalist causes privately, but then would be trying to carry out jobs in kind of mainstream conservative media, politics, etc. I mean, entryism isn't a tactic that's limited to white nationalists or the right. And it's basically, I mean, a way of shifting, getting into a political movement and then kind of taking small steps to kind of shift it in the direction that you want. And the Daily Caller, which Tucker was deeply involved with for years, obviously, was a place where, particularly in kind of like the 2016 era, there were kind of a lot of these entryist guys had taken up jobs there and were using their positions at the Caller. I mean, you reported on one of them in 2019, using his position at the Caller to kind of like help like whitewash certain white nationalist figures. What's kind of interesting is like you don't really need that anymore. I mean, Tucker Carlson is talking about the great replacement on Fox when he was still at Fox, and like the event I went to was him and Alex Jones and Jack Posobiec. Basically, like there are no guardrails, but there's like an asterisk there, and it's kind of like basically are openly at this event they were chanting 1776 and talking about revolution, and I mean Alex Jones doing his thing of talking about revolution and revolt against the globalists, like, and I think the fact that he's sharing the stage with Tucker is, and I don't know, I mean it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I want to follow up on your Trumpism comment, because I really liked what you wrote in your kind of post-election newsletter, which is you described Trumpism as a vacuous churning pit of resentment and grievance. And that insofar as that is what it is, it provides a blank slate for the radical right to indulge their own immature revenge fantasies. I wanted to kind of ask you more about that, but also how much that isn't even, maybe the revenge fantasies are especially relevant to the radical right, but how is that something that all sorts of people do with Trump, in terms of and Trumpism, like projecting seeing what they want to see. I mean, I have in mind recent reports on kind of executives and people who are really optimistic about what Trump's economic policies will do for America, when like, we have some pretty good evidence that we don't know what his tariffs are going to be, but it seems like they're going to be pretty bad for pretty much everyone. So like, but people are, they sort of taking what they want and being excited about what they want, and then just ignoring and saying, oh, he's not serious about the rest of that. And whether you see that as like a universal thing with Trump, why that might be, or to what degree is that just something that we are doing like as a society with politicians more broadly? I'm just interested in more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a universal thing with Trump. I think like there was the fascism debate, which I guess I sort of dipped my toe a little bit into there.
We can bracket it. I am allowed to say we're not going to sort that out here.
Yeah, I feel like that's one that just goes on forever.
Yeah, I agreed.
But like, I feel like there is this tendency to kind of like present different facets of Trump and maybe focus a lot on one of them. And I think it's understandable, because it is still kind of, to me, I think it's the reason why people end up doing that is because they still don't really know what to make of Trump, what he says, like what the fact that he just got reelected says about America, what his presidency previously said about America, etc. But I mean, I think like he definitely rode on a wave of racial resentment that, I mean, certainly he did not create. That, I mean, goes back obviously within American politics for centuries. I think that's kind of like that's kind of where a lot of this resentment comes in, because you can kind of like use him and like the right as sort of kind of a representation of that. So the retribution talk of I think is particularly interesting on that front, because I think that kind of really gets to the heart of it, is like what are they actually saying with this? They're not necessarily saying that they're doing retribution so that they're doing retribution so you can quote unquote make America great again, but then what do you even mean by making America great again? Like, it's kind of retribution, talk about retribution for the sake of retribution, as opposed to some movement going forward.
Again, like some sort of positive vision, actually. Positive, I'm using positive in a neutral, in a constructive vision, some sort of like actual image that you think you're going to bring about.
Yeah, exactly. And there's actually this, so the New York Young Republican Club just had their annual gala, and there's this quote from Steve Bannon at that, and the New York Times only had a snippet of it, but he basically says Donald Trump is leader of all the people. he's got a kind heart and big soul, but that's not us, right? We want retribution, and we're going to get retribution.
The fuck? Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, my experience going to that event 2 years ago is they were really big on talking about total war. But they seem to love doing that at least once a year. But at these fancy black tie galas where everyone gets dressed up and talk about total war. Anyway, normal.
Yeah, totally normal.
But yeah, I think that kind of does get to the heart of it, of kind of like it's that resentment, that anger, and they're channeling it. I mean, basically trying to find a way to channel that, but like to what end? And that's kind of where the emptiness of it all comes in.
And it's an emptiness that can then be kind of filled with whatever somebody wants to fill it with.
Exactly.
Well, that's great. We're never going to end this on overly optimistic note. That just wasn't going to be happening. But I do feel like we've aired out we've situated ourselves, I feel like, to some degree, after the election. It's also trying to remember what we've gone through, know that we are going to have to just keep trying to make sense of it and trying to fight against, push back against that kind of hatred. And that doesn't mean we have like the solutions to it right now, but I just think there's no way to get started without talking about it and confronting it. And so I really appreciate you walking us through all these like very dark, very complex issues, Hannah. And I'm glad to have somebody like you that I get to talk to about these kind of troubling times. So thanks for your patience and sharing your time with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. That was fun.
There's a few things that I want to review from this episode with Hannah. We'll link to some of her writings in the show notes too. First, Hannah and her co-author Casey Miller argue that the far right has transitioned over the years from more traditional organizing to what they call diffuse systems of decentralized radicalization. And this was especially evident in the January 6th attack on the Capitol, but it's still the case today. This doesn't mean that the ideas they support are any less powerful, but instead have become normalized. We talked about how there have been calls for new laws for prosecuting domestic terrorism in light of January 6th and far-right violence, but there's already a lot of existing laws, and local, federal, and state governments fail to use them and prosecute people. We were both concerned by calls for new domestic terrorism laws, which might increase civil liberty violations, just as we've seen foreign terrorism policy used to violate civil liberties. I think that this is only more important since Hannah and I talked, because under the new presidential administration, we've seen a lot more aggressive use of state power, especially with respect to immigration, including the detainments and deportations and imprisonment abroad without due process. Hannah cited the work of Mike Brennan on some of the issues that we face in terms of improving knowledge of and prosecution of far-right violence and why new domestic terrorism laws are unlikely to solve that issue. We'll link to a 2019 report he and his co-author Emmanuel Malian at the Brennan Center for Justice published on these very issues. We talk about how these far-right groups use the messaging app Telegram. We also talk about how since January 6th, there had been increased moderation of content on the app, as well as other events like arrests of certain figures, and the British Parliament's prescription of the Telegram collective on the app has made the use of this app for dissemination of these ideas much less popular. Though figures have also changed the way that they use the app as well. We can also compare this to X, where since its change in ownership, Hannah has seen a lot of the far-right figures she had studied come back to the platform after they were initially banned by Twitter. Finally, we talk a little bit about the broader mainstream conservative movement and coalition, as well as figures within that have supported the same far-right ideas and also are themselves trying to define, exploit, and lead Trumpism. Now that we're in the new Trump administration, I think we can see some policies and executive orders that clearly resonate with the white supremacist, white nationalist, xenophobic, and racist ideas perpetuated by far-right figures and groups. I think, for example, the immigration policies that I referenced earlier, as well as Trump's executive order and attempts to eliminate birthright citizenship. As I said, this was a difficult conversation, but I think it's an important one. And it's one that I think we should all be having with each other. I want to thank Hannah for sharing her work with us, and I want to thank you for joining us. Till next time.